Hello and welcome to the AI Ethics Now podcast. My name is Tom Ritchie and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Katharine Welsh and Laura Milne. Hi both.
Hi.
Hi, Tom. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what brings you to this conversation on AI and AI ethics, please.
Catherine, why don't you take it away?
Okay. I'm Katharine Welsh. I'm an Associate Professor of Academic Innovation at the University of Chester. And for the last 2 years, I've been working as a University Innovation Fellow. And one of my first roles, one of my first jobs within that role was to keep an eye on ChatGPT, and the rest is history, really. So I currently lead our AI and education working group at the university. I'm also a lecturer in geography 2 days a week.
Fantastic. And Laura?
I'm head of digital education at the University of Chester, so I do a lot of work with all sorts of digital learning tools, and I work really closely with Catherine on the AI and education working group and on various other exciting projects.
Amazing. I think you two are, exactly the right people to be speaking to on this topic. And with that said, let's jump straight in. So, given the rapid advancements in AI, how do you think we strike a balance between harnessing its potential for innovation and ensuring ethical use? And what do you think are some of the key challenges and potential pitfalls in that process?
I think it's really important that we equip students with the knowledge and skills to make effective use of AI where appropriate, both in their studies and beyond. So when they go out into the world of employment, they are going to be in jobs where they may or may not use artificial intelligence, or at least exist in a world where artificial intelligence is being used, I suppose. So I think it's really important that we do get that balance right, but also educate students about the ethical challenges associated with AI as well. And so one of the key things we do is try to educate students through an artificial intelligence literacies module, which is available to all students within our university. So I think that's really important that we do get a balance, recognizing that AI is kind of around, it's staying, and it's trying to ensure that we can effectively give students the skills and knowledge to take forward with them.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point and something we're trying to do at the University of Warwick as well with the AI Revolution module that this podcast has come from, particularly around that critical literacy, I think that comes with it, of recognizing it is a positive tool, it can be used in useful ways, but it does come with a series of challenges, as you say. Laura, how about you?
Yeah, I think that to start the conversation, many people might think that AI is just morally neutral or just existing in space without thinking about the impact that it might have, and that those impacts might be human. They might have impacts on the climate. They might have impacts on copyright law. So there are different ways that you can think about the ethical dilemmas associated with generative AI and AI in general. So while there's this huge, exciting opportunity in all the innovations that we can undertake, we also just have to be mindful of particularly the human factors. How's that data cleaned? How's that data acquired? Whose work is the machine learning from? And then the climate factor of the stat I heard the other day was it takes 20 times the cooling power to run a ChatGPT query as it takes to run a Google search. And now we've got this incredible tool at our fingertips. So we must just be mindful about how we can use it so that we don't just slide straight into climate disasters through our own sort of playing around with a tool. And I think some people do start off playing around with it as a toy rather than a tool, and then they need to slowly shift towards understanding the use of that tool.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. And I think sustainability for me is really important. One of the key ethical challenges, really. And I don't think we've got all the answers for how we solve those challenges yet. But I do think something, one of the things we teach is effective prompt engineering, so that the quality of the prompt is better rather than multiple queries and multiple prompts through there. I'm quite often thinking along the lines of just because we can doesn't mean we always should, with generative AI, for all of those ethical challenges and reasons that Laura's just mentioned.
Yeah, and I think it's really good to hear about what you're doing at Chester. I think one of the big challenges we have is that Laura, I take your point about the impact on climate change and the energy use of these platforms. The challenge is that through a lot of these podcasts, and I wonder what your perspective is on this, when we've really tried to think about what is it that AI can help with, so much of the conversation comes back to those daily mundane tasks and actually automating those and getting rid of those, which feels like it sits at odds with something that uses so much energy compared to, let's say, a Google search. And I wonder if you've had any thoughts on that, or if it's something you speak to your students about. Where, yes, I think you've mentioned it there, Catherine. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. But how do you have that conversation with students in a meaningful way?
I think Catherine and I have had several conversations about the role of the human involved in the process, and something we've talked about quite a lot is how transformative is the work that you're doing using generative AI. Because if you're doing it to automate a task, automating tasks has been around for a very long time. If you speak to anyone in engineering that has to do a mundane task, you can bet your bottom dollar that they're going to automate it so they don't have to do that same process regularly. Generative AI brings that within the reach of those of us who are slightly less technical, so we can automate some of the mundane stuff. But what I'm really interested in is what can we tap that we previously couldn't do because of generative AI. So how does generative AI empower us? How does it take us beyond where we are in our own knowledge, in our own skills? Um, I think it has the power to be quite transformative, but that doesn't stop me using it to do some data crunching or some first drafting or some initial ideas gathering, and that I'm sharing with my colleagues at the university, but I'm also sharing that with students through the work that we put together on the generative AI literacies module. What do you think, Catherine?
Yeah, I really agree with that, especially the transformative nature of it. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about any new technology is that what can we do that we couldn't do before, and how can this transform learning, or how can it transform, a sector because of that. But I think I really do have to think, I do think twice before I use an AI tool or generate. I always I think I've got this sort of little slogan about like think before you generate, because is this a mundane task? Is it something that's actually, some things like we've talked about in the past, by like reformatting or transforming into a different media, so from text to audio or something like that. That's something we perhaps couldn't do quickly or easily before, and I think that's got a lot of power. But I think some of the more mundane tasks, I don't know. I really have to wrestle with the ethical side of that, and against the sustainability, I suppose, for me. And I don't think everyone's going to sit somewhere differently along that spectrum of ethical challenges versus transformative learning and transformative power, I think, of AI. So I think it's really interesting, and I think it will develop, and I think it will evolve, and everyone will have a different perspective on it.
Yeah, and I think it's the real potential challenge in this space. We've had students on the module say to us, while we actively encourage them to use AI, we set AI tasks every week that we want them to do, to be critical and to learn about capabilities and limitations as well. We have had students say to us, but what if I don't want to use AI? And you almost feel like there is a point potentially coming in future where you can almost have, for want of a better term, like a conscientious objector towards AI, someone who says, actually, no, I'm not going to use this. One of the things we try to do with our students is do a lot of historical parallels as well, and look back to when I was at university. People were terrified of Wikipedia for very similar reasons, that maybe not the processing power, but that this thing just gives you all the answers, and it's fundamentally ruining degrees, and all of the kind of same narrative I tend to hear at the moment, where people are just saying, oh, well, people are just kind of posting AI generated essays in and things like that as well. I wonder, with that in mind, we've spoken a lot, and Laura, you've mentioned about the role of the human, and we talk about it in the context of human in the loop and the importance of the role that we can play. So I wonder both, how do you envision the role of AI in transforming education? And what do you see as the potential benefits and challenges of trying to integrate AI more into the classroom?
Yeah, I think for me, I think it will transform, or I'd like to think it would transform assessment and the assessment practices that we see. So moving away from essay-based assessment to the more authentic assessments, although in some areas maybe that is an authentic assessment, so we have to be careful about how we term that. But I think it is already starting to transform assessment, and I think it will continue to do so. We have to try to integrate it into our assessment practices, I think, and that's not where everybody's at the moment. And I think there's, again, back to the spectrum, there's a whole spectrum of, some people are completely into it and have already integrated it into their assessments. Others are absolutely against the idea. But I think over time, I think it really will transform the way in which we assess students.
So I think it's got a really powerful part to play in terms of unpacking the more complex concepts, the more challenging topics, maybe the more dense theoretical side of subjects, and explaining that in really human-friendly language. If I had ChatGPT during my undergrad, I would spend a lot less time being confused by certain philosophical texts I had to read, because I'd be able to ask it for a summary of Derridean approaches to literature or something like that. But I also think that there's a huge opportunity for that human AI conversation, and that's a really powerful space for feedback. So as a student, you should be really careful about whether or not you can use generative AI like this in a given module. But if there is a chance that you can maybe thrash out some early phase ideas for an assessment, or get some input on your introduction paragraph, if that's allowed at your university, that would be something that's really, really valuable and can support students to understand this academia space. And academic English is no one's first language, so that's something that really can be supported through careful generative AI use.
I agree with you, Laura, and I think as well there's a question here about assessment literacy that AI can help with. So assessment criteria can be challenging sometimes to understand what are you actually asking me to do here. And I think that AI is very useful, as you've said, at simplifying those concepts and actually making them easy to understand and easy to almost interpret. Is there a hidden curriculum here that I might not be seeing if you take all of these assessment criteria together? And we talk so much about trying to get rid of that hidden curriculum that I wonder if AI is a useful tool, particularly in that early ideation stage that you were talking about, when you are working on an essay or if you are working on another piece of work or writing a report. I think as well, Catherine, to come back to your point, at least in my experience, it'd be interesting to know the experience at Chester. We've lent much more into student devised assessments where we're actively encouraging AI to be used, but you can't use AI in the way I think people worry that you can, because we're asking people to speculate on the future, which AI can definitely help with, but we almost want them to be putting the human back in that loop again and saying, okay, bring your value. You know, if AI can help write this, fantastic. But where are you adding your specific value as a person who's studying law or a person who's studying history? But I know that that's not the case across my university. You know, they're just very limited modules. But I wonder if there are efforts to do similar at Chester, or if there's a different approach that people are using to try to incorporate and use AI in a slightly more intentional way, I suppose, when designing these things.
Yeah, I think there are across the university different areas where they are integrating this much more than others, and I think we're not particularly at this point encouraging it, but we're not discouraging it. We're saying, it's at your own pace, and we're happy for educators to take their time and feel comfortable with AI and think about how they might apply it if they want to. So, but there are definitely pockets across the university where this is being integrated. So, for example, in art and design, they are integrating AI as part of the design process. And kind of going back to what you said before, I think the formative phase and feedback can be really useful to use AI for student learning, but I think it needs to be done in quite a careful way. I'm quite cautious with a lot of this yet, and it's not that I don't think we can get there, but I think it's the speed at which we are going and kind of doing it in a very stepped way is where I'm at, I think.
I think that that's supported where you have that clear idea of the human in the loop, or as we've talked about a lot at Chester, the human AI sandwich, that you have this excellent human input at the beginning through a really well-crafted prompt. Then AI does something, and then you have to have human interpretation on the other side of it. So without a literacy around how that is supportive of taking the conversation forward with generative AI, you'll fall down if you don't have the human in the loop, basically. So that at the end of the day, we always come back to what role is the human playing, and if that human is a lecturer who's using generative AI, and if that's the role of the lecturer to help support students get to grips with how they're using generative AI, or if it's the student that's using generative AI to enrich an assessment or to enrich their early phase understanding, or to do, for example, the background work. If they're doing video game design, they might create assets using generative AI. That's also practice at Chester at the moment. That's really excellent use of generative AI. Those are all really enriching, but we need to be very aware of how we balance that with maybe offloading all the cognitive process just to generative AI, because that's something we're very clear about, that we want our students to be thinking graduates.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a few really interesting points, I think, Laura, just to pick you up on there. One is around, you said we don't just want AI to take on all the cognitive load of a degree. And I completely agree with that. I think one of the things that surprises our students is the extent to which it can hallucinate sometimes when doing background work. And so that's something we're really keen to say to students: just check. Absolutely use it to help you in the first instance, but don't just take it as gospel, because it is just an approximation. Once we've explained to students how these large language models work, I think it really surprises them. And you mentioned something as well, that it's about crafting really, really useful prompts at the beginning and then having the human there at the end to analyze it. But you said something happens in the middle. And I think that's something that kind of raises the most questions for my students, that kind of the black box of AI that we see sometimes, where things just kind of happen. And that, I think, that for me is what leads to a lot of questions around equity and kind of inclusivity, particularly for students in an education setting. There are some challenges in knowing exactly what's happening within these AI models, and actually being able to open that black box and understand it, because of the nature of AI, that the more complicated it gets, then that black box becomes more and more complicated. I don't know about you, I find that really hard to explain to students and to kind of get them to build up a sense of trust, I suppose. And one of the debates we've been having in classes has been, should different AI platforms have different almost like rating scores? So if you think about, you have like energy rating on homes where it says, you're a C. We've had these questions around, would there be space for these AI platforms to consider something like this? And actually, we're seeing universities tentatively move towards this space of using AI. So at Warwick, we kind of tentatively use Copilot. It'd be interesting to know what you use at Chester as well. But it's just, how do we know that these platforms are not everything that we're potentially nervous of that they could be, if they were to be designed in a potentially negative way? I realize there's not a huge question there, but I'd just be intrigued to see what your thoughts are on those points.
I mean, it would be fantastic if we had ratings of this is a gold star ethics platform, no humans were harmed, this was all trained on freely available copyright free data, it's run sensibly, and the processing is not done in the middle of the Californian desert that requires a lot of cooling power. That would be fantastic. It would be really, I would be very drawn to to any AI product that was able to list their credentials like that. I think that sort of credentialing would also expose to a lot of people how they things they're starting to take for granted might be a little bit dubious ethically. So at Chester, we also use Copilot in the browser. We don't have the Copilot Studio available at the moment. So if we are talking about a generative AI chat tool, we tend to be talking about Copilot. Personally, I've used pretty much all of the mainstream ones, though, to try them out and see what they're like. I tend to use Copilot. Copilot for work, but ChatGPT for non-work activities, because I find it slightly easier to use, slightly better to use. Yeah, I think it's really difficult to recommend a tool that has those potential ethical downsides. And I'm particularly conscious of the human side of it, including how and where the data is being cleaned for these models to use. And that's been something that's been flagged a lot, is the ChatGPT data is being cleaned using really underpaid labor in Kenya. So they've just exported that rather difficult, rather arduous task to somewhere else, so that people in the rest of the world can take advantage of underpaid labor again. So that's something I'm really, really conscious of. I don't think I've wandered from the point of it.
No, not at all. I think it's really interesting. I don't know, Katharine, if you have any reflections.
Yes, so one of the things we use at Chester is Teachermatic, and that's because we've been part of the JISC pilot for that tool this year. And the main strength for me of that piece of software is that the data are ring fenced and not used to train the models and so on. And so that gives us a bit more confidence that we have a little bit more control over the data and where that's going. And I think at the moment, data protection is a massive roadblock. It may be a temporary roadblock, but I think it's a roadblock to some of the innovation that I think across the sector we might see. But I think we're all still trying to get to grips with the data protection and privacy challenges of AI. One of the things we've got at Chester is our technical design authority, which if somebody wants to make use of an AI tool, it goes through that. It's led by our kind of computer services team. It's also got the data protection officer in there, so they have a look at these kind of tools and look at information security, data protection, and so on, so that we feel a little bit more confident in these tools. I mean, an independent body rating these tools would be absolutely the ideal. That would be really helpful, for universities. I think not just universities, but across the sector as well. But I mean, in terms of, you mentioned equality and inclusivity as well, and I think we stipulate within our guidelines that if an AI tool is being used, then the tool should be free. And if a student objects to using that tool for any reason, they should be able to choose a tool that has similar functions, but doesn't have to be ChatGPT, for example. It could be something else that they prefer. We don't prescribe a specific tool. We say this is a tool that can be used to fulfill these functions, but essentially the student can choose it themselves. So we were looking at other AI tools like Claude, for example, which is I believe they described it as constitutional AI. I think the idea of constitutional AI is that rather than having this scraped data that might be quite biased and discriminatory, the output of that type of AI tool, developers of the tool can have some sort of input to say and give me the least biased response. But of course, that's then sitting with the developer to make those decisions about what is actually being brought out of that AI tool, or generated, I should say. So I think that's in an interesting area, and I wonder how that will go forward. I think we're still in a really interesting phase. I'm really interested to see where it will go to, and I think we're just in that sort of, everyone's in the exploration phase with it and trying to figure out what the challenges are, what the benefits could be, and how we could get there.
I mean, in terms of that sort of black box and processing happens in places we can't see using data we can't see, it's also interesting to think about the types of knowledge and the types of data that these models have access to. So by default, there are oral traditions that are never going to be consumed by large language models. So they're going to be knowledges across the world that we're not going to see outputs from generative AI that refers to that, because it's just unknown and unknowable to this type of large language model. So I think thinking about the knowledges that get privileged through this type of process is really interesting, because you see whose opinions get taken more seriously through that. So it naturally has to encode some sort of bias, even if you try to opt for an unbiased output. There's always going to be bias in there because of whose data has been feeding the beast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a real challenge there around the very nature of a lot of these large language models. They are, by their nature, English speaking, Anglophonic. There are challenges that come with even the fact that they're regression models. So even if you can capture some of that knowledge from, let's say, this, someone who has an oral tradition, the model itself will tend not to choose that, because you have a much bigger group of data over here from English speaking sources as well. And I think what really comes through is how quickly a lot of this moves. And I know that in the time that we've been running this module, it's almost entirely changed again. So we've had to be almost week to week updating what we're talking about and showing students, because it would be out of date if we'd planned it all in week one. So I wonder then, looking ahead, what do you see as the most pressing ethical challenges facing AI in the coming years in an education context?
Probably the biggest challenge for me will be getting to a stage where we can see into that black box a bit, because then the critical thinking that goes along with our AI use will be able to be much enhanced. So ethically, that's going to expose a whole lot of places where systems have been taking liberties with data, have been taking liberties with copyright, and we're probably going to need to have a solid sit down and think about how comfortable we are really with how these systems are scraping the internet, how they're scraping various online sources, and putting together things that aren't original, but they're not entirely unoriginal either. So I think thinking through issues of copyright and how information gets used and repurposed is going to be a big one for me. Particularly thinking how that's going to impact the production side of what assessment is. So we do keep circling back around to assessment issues because that's a big pain point for universities. Students are worried that they're the only ones not using AI, or they're worried that they're not using AI right when they should be using AI. So we keep coming back to assessment because that's a really high stakes thing for students and staff. So if we get to grips with copyright, I think that's going to give us a few more pauses for thought as we consider how and when we should be using generative AI in everything we do, from unpacking sources in the classroom to getting feedback on partially done work to maybe even reviewing and marking student work as a staff member. How ethically can we use that to support our work as we go through our jobs? What do you think, Catherine?
Yeah, I totally agree with the data side of things, and I think that's over time. I think that, as you say, if we look into the black box, and I think there will be a lot of cleaning up of practices over the years. I think that can address some of those challenges that we have around bias and discrimination or that type of thing. I think longer term, the big there's two real ethical challenges on top of the data for me. One is where tools are being paid for by students, and so advantaging some people and disadvantaging others. And if some have access to tools that have more capabilities, I think that's really unfair, and I think that's a really difficult thing to address. And that, I suppose, comes back to the universities to ensure that the tools that they subscribe to or have licenses for are suitable and do all the kind of whizzy things that other tools do as well. But of course, I'm circling back to how I started really with this, and it's for me, and I suppose this is my background in geography as well, but coming back to the sustainability issue, that's just a massive mountain to climb to try to address that. We're already facing major challenges with climate emergency, and so this adding to it, that's just another challenge, because of course if it does make things easier, if it transforms learning or transforms sectors, of course people will want to use that. So how do we then, how can we make it so that we are using less energy? It's not a case of just offsetting it, it's actually doing better, or better prompts is all we can sort of do at the moment. But I think longer term we need a better strategy than that. And I say we, and I mean that we as a planet, rather than just us, the three of us here.
It's really interesting listening to you talk about all of these things, because for me, one of the conversations we've been trying to have with our students is imagine into 2040 now. So we're not just imagining next year, the year after. What could that potential future look like? What could the positives of AI be? So absolutely taking the point about the climate impact, and there are challenges of ethics, but what could education look like in 15 years' time if we can kind of fundamentally transform it with AI? And I think that gives a really exciting space as well. But I completely agree with what you're both saying about this set of challenges that we have, particularly in relation to using AI and integrating it further. I think for me, it's the most interesting thing that we've seen with students is when they came to the course for us, they very much understood it to be one thing. And now that we're kind of at the end of the module, They very much understand AI to be something different in terms of how they use it, what the balance is, what the value is, and their kind of critical approach to it. So I wonder, for the last question, if you would have any thoughts on what do you think are the most important steps that we can take to ensure a positive future with AI?
I have some hope on that front because I know that this is thinking a few years back, but I used to guest lecture on a module that one of the topics was thinking about blockchain, and blockchain used to be incredibly resource heavy, and there was a huge impact of mining for blockchain on electricity use, for example. And in the recent past, there have been some adaptations to make that less energy intensive. So while we're still in this development phase of generative AI, I think things are going to be more expensive. Like the early days of space travel is also really, really environmentally expensive. And I have a hope that as things progress, we are going to get more energy efficient. We are going to get more streamlined approaches. Maybe there'll be pre-generated responses to common queries or something similar to that. I can't look into a crystal ball, because if I did, it would make writing next year's resources much, much easier. But I do have a little bit of faith that if it is proven to be a useful tool, and it looks every which way that it does look like a useful tool, people will start to be obliged to make it more efficient. Maybe I'm too optimistic there.
I think for me, it's about developing literacy for staff, students, general population about AI, and giving them the information and knowledge about it. So, giving them the critical thinking skills, offering the ethical challenges, and getting them to think critically, really, about the what's coming out of an AI tool, and thinking about whether or even the critical thinking around whether or not they should even be using an AI tool. So I think for me, it's developing that literacy and supporting people to develop the literacy around AI.
Thank you both so much. Really, really good to chat, and hope to speak to you again soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.